Okay, good morning, everyone. This morning we have a rather different session that we try to provide a conversation and try to open a dialogue path between labor struggles, labor movements, and ecological movements. So what we would like to do is to enter in a dialogue, into a conversation rather than a lecture with you guys. And we have a guest today, this morning, who will also help us to further advance on the labor issues and how they may link, how they may relate, and how they may contradict the ecologist agendas, actually. Kivanc is with us from the Confederation of Progressive, or in its Turkish version, Revolutionary Trade Unions of Turkey. And before starting, we actually planned this session, as I said, to be a dialogue. So we would really like you to come forward after this very short presentation so that we sit in a circle and try to engage in a couple of rather tough questions that labor movements and ecologist movements so far has failed to answer fully. So to start with, I would like to give a bit of a background on what we mean by the convergence of movements in praxis. And I would like to start with two images that you may or may not be familiar of. Has anyone seen this before, or do you guess where it's from?
Onshore workers union, Pacific Coast, maybe California, locally?
Not exactly, but but on the western coast. That's correct. So if this didn't help, maybe this one might help actually. Yes, that is Seattle. So back in '99, we have actually witnessed a key moment in the global justice movement's emergence in a different mode, as some dub it alter globalization or anti-globalization. And one of the key moments in this convergence was the argument with Teamsters and Turtles. So the first one was the Teamsters, the syndicates, the trade union activists, and the other ones were basically environmental activists who were defending sea turtles. And actually, Seattle was an emblematic reunion of those two groups, which was later taken into many different articles as this, like Turtles and Teamsters United at Last. And actually, in the years that followed, in the past 16 years after Seattle, we've seen this slogan coming up again on many different occasions, including the famous COP15, Copenhagen Climate Summit, and actually now on the road to COP21, Climate Summit in Paris, we see different versions of this argument, one of them being actually a Blockadia argument of Naomi Klein, also linking trade issues, industrial workers, and environmental and climate activism. And I think it's telling that typically, like those groups that are typically uninterested in the environmental question per se, as it's in its purest form, are actually converging from both sides on the use of this argument, particularly in bringing workers' autonomy and democracy in the workplace, but more than it, basically ensuring a better life for all, not for those peasants out there in the field only, but also for the industrial workers themselves who are concerned with environmental matters. And here is a quotation from the former director of the Canadian Automobile Workers Union, Sam Ginden is an activist turned academic who is teaching at York University in Canada. And he says that actually, if we are really serious about incorporating the environmental needs into economy, we need to change the way we produce and consume and how we travel and how we live. And he actually argues that the equipment that we have in hand, the current installed industrial capacity, doesn't need to be used in its current form only. I mean, it may as well be transformed. So that actually, instead of producing cars, we may actually reconfigure the existing industrial system by reshaping it in a way that it contributes to this, be it called circular economy, degrowth, or solidarity economics. So it may be used in different versions and different forms. And actually, he suggests that we cannot, from one day to another, jump over the accumulated knowledge and experience that has gathered through this industrialization process. But we may consider ways of how to use it better for the society and the environment together as a one and inseparable unity. And actually this means a call towards what we've been hearing a lot over the week and what we hear a lot from radical scholars as well, a transition into a new economy or exit from the existing economy as such. And this has particular aspects to it as its alternatives. And most often we talk about an energy transition. We talk about a worker-owned production system, which we have seen actually a prime example yesterday with all of its shortcomings as well in Kazova as workers' cooperative. Then, of course, direct access to agricultural production without intermediaries, credit unions, alternative monetary systems, public transportation, owning the means of production themselves, as well as community food and dwelling resources. But to reach this new economy, I guess we still need to spend a lot more time thinking on how we may actually go beyond the minor experiments, or how we can actually bring together the minor experiments in putting together a broader consortium who would push for such changes. And today, one of the issues that I would like to raise in that sense is the possibility or impossibility of green syndicalism. So whether this may provide an alternative, whether this may actually help to bridge different concerns, particularly in terms of degrowth debates and solidarity economics and so on and so forth. So how can we actually try to move towards an alternative red-green/black vision? And I've been looking into the work of Jeff Shantz, who is also an activist turned academic, also from Canada. And he suggests that actually the radical syndicalist tradition has a lot to offer to radical ecology movement. And there is a big opportunity for coming together and sharing certain concerns. And some of the key strategies that Jeff Shantz underlines are actually the key methods of key approaches of the radical syndicalist tradition, which is exemplified by the Industrial Workers of the World Union, or in other words, Wobblies. And he argues that these strategies, these methods, are consensus formation, participation of equals, dialogue, decentralization, and autonomy, which, I guess, if you take out of this context and put it in the context of degrowth, or put it in the context of solidarity economics, would go perfectly well. So I think we talk about similar methods, similar issues, but we talk in different domains and different circles. So this session, I hope, will also help to consolidate some of the debates that are ongoing in these different circles. And this approach, green syndicalism approach, actually recognizes that the ecological crisis or ecological crises are made possible only within a certain configuration of social relations. And this also requires a weakening of the people's capacity to constitute a coordinated action. This may be for labor justice in a factory scale, or this may be for planetary justice in the global commons scale. So this requires action towards these issues, require a coordinated action. But existing ecological crisis with its social relations, which is capitalism basically, in its neoliberal enactment, makes a certain drawback for the communities. And within green syndicalism, which is a yet emergent topic, there are some debates within the labor movement itself, but the main assumption of green syndicalism is that actually labor struggles and ecological struggles are not separate, and there is a connectedness between the historical radical moments and historical radical movements. And actually, these histories are particularly important because history of the radical labor movement is not only or solely a history of compromises. Actually, it's much beyond that, because Buchan, who we addressed very little so far this week, and who actually keeps popping up in different domains, because we speak about decentralization, we speak about autonomy, we speak about accumulation, and solidarity economics, and then we basically refer to the whole tradition of critical geographers and so on and so forth. But Buchan, not only in our political ecology networks, these circles, but also beyond this, is an often ignored figure. However, in the Turkish case, it's pretty telling that actually Kurdish movement, the Rojava, on the Rojava experience, actually, we again spoke very little on this, but it was highly inspired by the writings of Buchan, since Öcalan accessed books of Buchan, and actually there was a massive community who has been reading Buchan and debating on that. However, Murray Buchan, was pretty concerned with the labor movement as a locomotive of the history, if you wish. So I will try to come back to that with a small note. But all in all, in the labor movement, these issues of environmental struggles are on the agenda, and they are coming. However, with little interaction with ecologist movements so far. And there is this new report of ITUC, which is the International Trade Unions Confederation, of which DISC, Confederation of the Revolutionary Workers Trade Union, is a member. It's a new report on the frontline communities, and it's on climate justice. It's called No Jobs on a Dead Planet, where they actually give a number of examples on how labor movements and ecologist movements may come together, and how actually these issues pose risks to existing industrial system as well. So basically they identify in this report two concepts, one of which is the industrial transformation. So we are, if we are on the verge of an upcoming transformation of the industrial system, then it means that actually workers should have a right to know on how this transformation or transition will be lived. And so it basically means also workplace justice and how this transition will be constituted. And the second is basically how spatially and temporally this transformation will take place. So how our new configuration of the industrial system will impact the future of the people, both human and non-human worlds. So some names who have actually influenced this tradition might be telling to give an idea before we proceed to the debate, one of which is Judy Barry, who was a trade union organizer and in the Industrial Workers of the World Union, and also in the Earth First movement. And Barry actually argued that we need to challenge the system of industrial capitalism, which is based on the ownership of the earth, which is an issue we actually spoke a lot in the political ecology circles. However, she also emphasized that there are similarities in the styles and forms of tactics in the labor and ecology movements. So we may actually focus on these rather than the common depictions within the radical ecology tradition, as exemplified by Buchan and some others, who basically discard the existing commonalities. And according to Barry, actually, this radical ecology tradition needs to engage with poor and working class people, which is also at the heart of the environmental justice debate, and argues that actually we need to shut down the machinery of ecological destruction, and this needs to go through workers' control. And in another writing that she was discussing the potential convergence of labor and environmental movements, she was also criticizing the role that's played by the mainstream environmental actors. And Judy Barry herself was a key figure in bringing together the loggers union in California with the environmental movements in the region. And actually she said that more than the whole industrial system or the industrial logging, one compromise made in an office building by a white-collar, very well-intentioned Sierra Club member may actually cause more destruction than a logger can cut in a lifetime. And I think this is pretty telling, because we are not even talking about a white-collar worker of Chevron or ExxonMobil, but we are talking about Sierra Club and some other what Naomi Klein would name as Big Green. So this is an issue for the labor movement as well. Another name that I've briefly mentioned, I'll try to skip this pretty quickly, is Buchan. Buchan was a very important figure for the ecology movement in many senses, and he has spent parts of his life in different traditions, coming from a trade unionist perspective, then a Marxist perspective, then an anarchist perspective, and then actually also exiting the anarchist perspective and then demonstrating his social ecology vision. Particularly, Buchan was not very fond of, or he wasn't very convinced that workers can actually contribute to ecological integrity in that sense, or trade unions per se, because he was skeptical about the role that the syndicates play. But his social ecology approach has contributed with some of its methods to green syndicalism or syndical ecology as a strategy. And as you probably already know, his argument was very much based on a decentralized, municipalized economy, where actually decision-making in economic matters come through the hands of assemblies and a coordination between producers and consumers are achieved through community deliberation. Another issue probably we should take into consideration in this debate is the role of the working classes, of the labor movements in challenging the carbon-based, hydrocarbon-based economies. Tim Mitchell has this very interesting book called Carbon Democracy, where he actually explains the history of the evolution of democracy through the organization of coal workers at the beginning, and then how transition into an oil-based system, oil-based global economy, smashed the particular social democratic forms of working power. And actually, in one section, he focuses on a key issue, which is a rather unspoken issue, or rather ignored issue, which is sabotage, which was a big issue back in the day, in early 20th century, because workers had the power to control the flow of energy, and they had the power to halt systems. Basically, through this power they had, mostly in the coal-based economy, and much less so due to the physical constraints of an oil-based economy. And actually, American economist Veblen, back in 1920s, also argued that this was not only a tool in the hands of workers, but also companies actually used this sabotage, basically sabotaging the production processes in order to raise prices by restricting output and ensuring a shortage. So he names it as the capitalization of inefficiency. So basically we speak a lot about Jevons paradox and efficiency and so on and so forth, but there is another aspect to it where actually inefficiency is capitalized on, and it's being turned into money. Very brief examples on the potential, some of the practices of such movements. Jeff Shantz again gives this example of the Builders and Labourers Federation in New South Wales, Australia. Back in 1970s, this was a syndicate of actually construction workers who opposed a big public housing project where they may have actually gotten a lot of benefit from in the name of saving public space in Sydney, and they've actually refused to work on such destructive projects. And this was actually against their own economic interests, but this was amidst the huge construction development boom, which was actually destroying the low-income communities, low-income neighborhoods. So it's very much also linked to the first presentation that we heard from IFASH on the gentrification of the communities. Often those people who live in the peripheral or gecekondu communities, slum communities, they are also working in construction of different gentrification projects. They are themselves the constructors of a different city, a different urban ecology. So basically, to give some food for thought, this idea of green syndicalism conceives a transformation of work, both its structure and its meaning. So what work might mean as an ecological imperative. And the existing forms of work-ecology relations may not be very suitable to find solutions to existing problems. And transformation of particular sectors are very much on the agenda in different debates. Eco-socialist groups actually discuss this issue. Degrowth circles debate this as well. So there are different circles which are probably tangent to each other or going parallel, but not necessarily overlapping. And what most of them agree on is that such a transition will require a focus on the provision of food, transport, and energy, but as well as restoration, reconstruction, renovation, and different meanings given to what work may entail. This is a photo from a much recent demonstration, 24th of April of last year in New York, when there was the People's Climate March. So we see that actually this issue will stay on the agenda, but it may only be successful as long as we provide clearer pathways, clearer visions of how labor and ecologist movements may come together. And labor movement has a big potential in contributing to the liberation from the existing industrialist economist system. However, we have a couple of questions, and these are hard questions to answer, on what we will do with the remains of the existing industrial infrastructure in a transition economy. So how we will handle the toxic remains of the current system in place, and what does this mean across scales? Basically, there is the workplace safety, security, and justice. So there is the issues with popular epidemiology, which Stefania and Marco write a lot, actually. But then again, on the other end of the spectrum, we have protection of the global commons. So how do we link these issues? And without romanticizing the role that may be played by the workers, what can a green syndicalist approach offer us in answering some of these hard questions? How to actually decommission some of the system that we think as not fit for the next generation of socio-ecological thinking. And this means actually a focus on shared responsibility, a focus on convivial ways of living, which degrowth makes a big emphasis on, and as well as a focus on human and non-human worlds. And I would like to close with a photo which I find very telling. On the top it says, "Energy is the basis of development." And this photo is from Yatağan coal-fired thermal power plant during the privatization of the thermal power plant in Yatağan, where actually workers were attacked by the police. And some of those West you may remember from yesterday, from Jandarma. And actually, during the privatization process of Yatağan coal-fired power plant, villagers in Yirca and miners in Soma, so a delegation from them actually paid a visit in solidarity with these workers, which may, from a first look, be a typical enemy, because villagers in Yirca were fighting against the construction of a coal-fired power plant in their villages, whereas in Soma, where this mining tragedy, this labor murder happened, with 301 miners dying in the coal pit. So I think it's telling that the production, the consumption, and the surrounding processes of labor and ecologist movements has a potential to come together and then talk more and elaborate more on what are the potential contributions of these Teamsters and Turtles debates, and how can we envision the future of industrial labor in an ecologically sound alternative. For example, what does it mean to have an industrial system under degrowth economy? What will be the use of the existing systems? And how does work beyond the industrial setting may carry an emancipatory potential? So basically we focused a lot on the industrial system, but there is a huge dimension of the rural wage labor as well, which should be considered. And what may it mean to have a political ecology of the industrial landscapes with a focus on the workers themselves, not as victims, but as the agents of change? And of course, as I said at the beginning, how can examples such as Kazova might be instructive? What are their shortcomings and what are their strengths in terms of moving towards this direction? So I would like to wrap it up here. It was a bit longer than I've estimated it to be, but I hope you didn't get bored. So now I would like to invite you to come in a circle, if you don't mind, and then we have, first I would like to get some comments from Kivanc on the work they do in DISC, and then we can actually start a conversation considering some of these points. So would you mind coming here in circles? So I would like to actually start with maybe a brief introduction on the history and the role that DISC plays in Turkey, not only for the labor struggles, but also for the overall social movements in Turkey, like historically and so on and so forth. And then we may go on how actually this convergence of labor and environmental movements may play out.
Thank you. So I would like to thank Ethemcan firstly for his presentation, because it could be more or less my presentation in such meeting. So I'm happy that I'm not going to repeat what he presented already. And I will try to keep my speech short rather than a presentation. I'm here to listen your ideas because I informed my colleagues in the office that I'm going to Bogazici for a session about ecology. Then they said, okay, so it's going to be short, because trade unions in Turkey are almost doing nothing about ecological movement. So I'm here to learn something from you rather than making a presentation. So briefly about my organization, which is DISC, the Confederation of Progressive Trade Unions. We are an umbrella organization of trade unions. We mostly represent blue-collar workers in private sector, and mostly we represent and recruit workers from the multinational foreign investments. And proud to say that we are one of the main troublemakers in the country, together with 3 more professional organizations, which namely KESK, which is the Confederation of Public Employees. I guess we have some KESK members here in the room. So Teachers Union is an affiliate of KESK, and Chamber of Doctors and Chamber of Engineers, TTB and TMMOB. Probably you heard those 4 organizations during a couple of days. Yeah, usual suspects or the troublemakers. So we are trying to be kind of independent, democratic, and left-wing trade union organization in the country. So, as Ethemcan already mentioned, we are an affiliate of ITUC, which is the International Trade Union Confederation, which is the international umbrella organization for trade unions, except the Chinese trade unions. ITUC represents more than 100,000 workers and represents most of the trade union organizations from the countries. So let's say the leadership in ITUC for the last couple of years, there are lots of Australians in the secretariat, so they are more friendly with the environmental issues, including the general secretary. She's former leader of the ATUC, the Australian Trade Union Congress. So she's trying to push the organization involved more with environment issues or ecology. So as Ethemcan mentioned, the main motto, main slogan of the ITUC is "No jobs at a dead planet." So let's say during the last Congress of ITUC, while talking about workers' rights, we mentioned that workers are losing their jobs or their life because of the privatization, because of the occupational accidents or occupational murders, and because of the climate change. So climate change is a union issue, because our members are losing their life or our members are losing their jobs. You can guess lots of examples from the Hurricane Sandy to lots of examples. Workers, thousands, 10,000s of workers lost their job. And ITUC is asking for a industrial transformation. Ethemcan already mentioned about that. So let's talk about the Turkish issue. Those four usual suspects. We mostly organize the first meetings of the environmental movements or any kind of social movements. We give our offices, our venues for the first meetings. We give the first signatures, then a movement started against nuclear plants, against gentrification, or against the cutting down of the trees in Yirca, or even in the Gezi Park. So the first invitation came from the trade unions, but then in most of the cases, including Gezi Park movement, we couldn't do our best, but the people's movement doesn't need us anymore, so they can lead a huge movement. But first invitation was mostly coming from the unions. Ethemcan talked about the coalition between Teamsters and Turtles. So that's a question that we are asking, how we can strengthen the coalition between ecology movement and trade unions. So that's why I'm here, to listen to you. So I'll just give some notes. For example, the right to strike in Turkey is a kind of main discussion among the trade union movement now. So right to strike is really limited, almost impossible to implement. So we are asking for better rights about right to strike. Like we can only start a legal strike after a disagreement in collective bargaining process. But we are asking for right to a solidarity strike or general strike or political strike. For example, we went on strike to protest war in Afghanistan or war in Iraq. We have an agenda like that. To stop a war, we use our power from services or production. But we never plan a strike to convince our government to sign the Kyoto Protocol or to do something else about ecology. So this is not in our agenda, but we have to put this. So it's in the equal level with trying to stop a war, trying to stop the climate change. It must be in the same volume. So, and maybe we have to recruit workers from the recycle sector, which is a huge sector in Turkey. Probably in Istanbul you noticed lots of people collecting garbage and used paper. So it's a huge sector, and we don't have any single member in the sector. So maybe we have to recruit them in movement, in organization, and we have to campaign to promote their working conditions. So it's a kind of contribution from the trade union movement into the ecology movement. So it's also we have to force our employers, whom we sign a collective agreement, to use renewable energy rather than garbages, rather than fossils. Maybe it can be an article in the CBAs, in the collective bargaining agreements. It's like we are asking, we convince employers about the working hours, about the working conditions, about the color of the uniform, about the food in the restaurant. So maybe we can push them to use renewable energy. So it can be an article in the CBA talks. So it's same for the Kazova case maybe. Those kind of small scale workers dominated factories or workplace, they can use some kind of renewable energy or recycled sources. So that can be kind of contribution from trade union movement into ecological movement. And lastly, Ethemcan mentioned about booking, and he's skeptical about trade union movement. So we are not, even he's skeptical about us, we are not skeptical about him. So we are using his articles and writings during our trainings, especially in the region of Diyarbakir, which we represent 100% of the municipal workers. Together with the mayors and together with the municipality, we are trying to organize some kind of services or production with renewable energy, with solar energy, and while doing this in the trainings, we are using articles of Moray Bukin. So for now, it's that's all, and I'm happy to hear your ideas or experiences to combine, to strengthen the coalition between Turtles and Teamsters. Thank you.
Thank you, Kivanc. As I said at the beginning, we would like this to be a conversation, so please feel free to intervene and ask questions, so it's going to be like that. Now that Kivanc actually introduced some of the issues that are on the agenda of DISC, like the collective bargaining agreements and so on, I think these are some tools that we often do not really consider as part and parcel of the ecologist strategies. But they may as well be taught on how these can be actually used. And I realized that I actually forgot to introduce Kivanc properly, because he is not only the international relations director of DISC, but he is also an author. He has 2 books, and he studied cinema and labor economics, so he comes from this diverse background, which may also contribute to the ongoing debates. And if I'm not mistaken, he is also one of the founders of Gençsen, the youth syndicate, formerly.
When I was young.
Yes, when he was young, which was an important initiative here in Turkey. So one question I have is actually on, in order to enter the debate from the belly of the beast, is the issue of coal and coal mining, coal consumption. What we have seen in Soma, Yirca, Yatan, partly. So how do you think actually a transition into a decarbonized economy might mean? What would it mean for the people in these sectors, in coal mining sector, coal consumption sector? So how actually we may be able to bring together people who have serious livelihood concerns, like in the case of Yirca, because you've been in Soma and then you've been following the case, and possibly also the case in Yirca. So how those issues may come together, what would be their common concerns and what would be their contradicting interests?
2 weeks ago, we were in Netherlands together with the miners from Soma. I don't know if we have any Dutch participants in the room. So we've been to Netherlands with the miners to meet with the miners from Netherlands. But there are no miners in Netherlands. Netherlands closed down all the mines 35 years ago, something like that. Or they gradually closed down all the mines. So we met with the pensioners, we met with the retired miners or their sons. We met families, like from grandpa to grandson, they're all miners, but the grandsons became workers in chemistry factories. We've been to mining museum. We watched a documentary about Dutch mines, Dutch mining plants and mining industry. So the miners from Soma, while they're watching the movie, and the movie is about 60s, they told, this is today Soma. So we are using this almost same equipment, almost same technology. And let's say in Netherlands they said no, we don't need to drag coals anymore. Partly it's expensive, partly cause pollution. They have some new kind of energy resources, but also they are buying some coal from Turkey, Colombia, and Belarus. So in that meeting we met with the Colombians and the Belarusian miners too. So story in those three countries are quite similar to each other. The working conditions, occupational murders, occupational illnesses, and repression against the trade union movement from the government is more or less in Belarus and Turkey is quite similar. In Colombia it's worse than us. So in Turkey they just detain us, but in Colombia they just directly kill. So there's an idiom from Colombia which says being a guerrilla is more easy than being a trade unionist. So Colombia is in worst case for us. Let's say most of the miners in Soma, they are not from the region. They are kind of local or domestic migrants to Soma. But those from the Soma region, they are former farmers. So after economic and environmental transition, they became miners. They lost their olive trees, they lost their tobacco fields, and to survive, to earn their bread, they became miners, and most of them still have small gardens. So mostly it's a kind of dilemma between environmental movement and trade unions. You know, trade unions are asking for employment to protect the jobs, but the energy plant and the coal mines are destroying the farms. But in Soma, it's the same people. Miners are former farmers, and miners have their gardens. To continue their traditional jobs, they have to fight against gentrification, against new construction. So it's more or less same people. But miners in the grassroots knows this issue, but it's difficult to convince the trade union leadership because they are sitting in Ankara in their offices with jacket and tie, and they don't understand the issue. They don't know the miner and the farmer is the same guy or the same family. But in the Soma, some of the miners, union activists, are in the front lines of the resistance for the olive trees, and I know we have some activists from this campaign, so I'm not going to go in details, but in Soma it's the same people. Farmers and the miners are the same people.
I think some of the points that you've raised are extremely relevant. Since you've mentioned Colombia, I think it's worth mentioning that Turkey's coal imports from Colombia has increased significantly over the course of last 5 years. Now Turkey imports about 30% of its imported coal from Colombia, and it's an important issue because coal production and consumption actually degrades lives along the commodity chain. And actually the issue with the agriculture in Soma is particularly interesting because we may further go into, I'm sure Olcay has a lot to say on that in the case of Yirca, but with the agricultural reform that was put in place after 2001 economic crisis and so on and so forth. So basically how the agricultural system was dismantled with the neoliberal reforms and how it pushed people to look for jobs in the mining sector and then so on and so forth. So with this, I would like to also open the floor to your questions on how these issues may be framed, how they are linked, and how they can be overcome. So let's start with Olcay and then go to Bea.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. I have one question to Kivanc on the intermediary workers. Because everywhere where I'm working on these environmental cases, mostly the cases are just based on the destruction of the environment as well. So it is going all together. So ecological destruction and the destruction of the rights of the workers at the same time. So in Zonguldak case, it happened. In Yirca, in Soma case, it was happening as well. So the question came into my mind after the discussions and the conversations with the workers, who are mostly intermediary workers. So they have very little rights. They do not have any work security. They do not have any health security, no guarantee to continue their work. So it is mostly, so we are asking transformation of the production. We are asking transformation of the usage of energy on the environmental perspective. But we are as well asking the transformation and development of the rights of the workers as well, because the investors, they are trying to get more profit, so they are investing less on the environmental cases, they are investing less on the workers' rights. So it is on those areas where I'm working on the coal-fired power plant issues. Majority of the workers are intermediary workers. So it is so difficult for them to resist on what is happening on their own land, as you mentioned. It is their land, it is their village. It is their village's destruction. It is their food which is going away from their hands. But they cannot say anything, they cannot resist, because they are not organized under unions. They are not organized in any forms. So what is DISC is doing now, just on this, as I understand you have now new connections on this environmental green syndicalism, you are just working on green syndicalism. So is there any cases that you are working on this coal power plant or mining workers, intermediary workers issues? So I find it very important to develop their rights. It will give more power to us, to all of us, to continue on developing the environmental issues. Thank you.
Thanks. Bea? Let's get like 3 comments, questions, and then we get it.
Thank you, Ethem, for your presentation. Also, you for inspiring us to the debate. My comment was started where you Tam finished, because you've focused your presentation on labor movements in the industrial sectors, but there are also labor movements in the rural areas, and we know the work of La Via Campesina, etc. And they have this line of peasant agriculture cools down the earth, and I've always related this to this idea that the type of inputs they use tend to be more in the line of lower emissions. But now I realize through your examples, both of your examples, that also makes small-scale agriculture makes rural societies more resilient to the arrival of these extractive fossil fuels models that are imposing to them, and then they are increasing emissions. So I don't know if this could be a point for discussion as well.
Thank you for great presentations. My question actually follows from these. In terms of strategy, I would think that it makes more sense, and I'm coming from India where there have been strong movements against mining by people who are going to be displaced by them, that it would make more strategic sense to ally with those who are fighting against mining, which would be mainly rural people of the kind that you mentioned, rather than with mining workers. And the reason I say that is because mining workers, and in fact most industrial workers around the world, are not organized. They're in the informal sector, and it's, you mentioned intermediate workers, but there are workers of all kinds who have no way of trying to act together. And even if they do want to organize, then it's mainly to try and get better conditions of work within mining, rather than leave the sector altogether. So if you could tell us just a little bit about strategically how you see the future. I mean, who are going to be your partners? Who are going to be people that are going to be left out of this in some ways?
Yes, thank you. There's one obvious thing that workers' movements and environmental movements have in common, which is an interest for democratizing production, deciding collectively what to produce, how, and for whom. And I suppose that implies being significantly more ambitious about the types of struggles and the types of objectives that we have as movements. So I suppose, yeah, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, if there are those types of conversations as well with activists.
Let's say, according to International Labour Organization, ILO, Turkey is one of the worst countries for trade unions, for workers' rights. So most of our trade union activities are prohibited, limited, banned, and so. So let's start from the rural workers. There is an organization in Turkey which is an affiliate of Via Campesina, and it's closed down by a court verdict. So farmers doesn't have a right to organize a union in Turkey. So the Via Campesina affiliated was banned by the government, but they don't care. They just continue their activities, namely Çiftçisen, it's the syndicate of farmers. They're really doing good job, even government banned their activities. So it's same for the most of the sectors, like it's same for the domestic workers, pensioners, police, prosecutors and judges, students, unemployed. So most of the trade union activities are restricted by the laws or by the local authorities. And most of the trade union members are members of yellow unions. From the beginning, Turkish trade union movement organized by AFL-CIA in late 40s. So it's the reason of its extinction is to stop trade union movement. So there are some splits, kind of left-wing independent democratic splits. So for example, in Soma, all miners who were killed 2 years ago, they were union members, they were unionized. So we're not using the word occupational accident, rather we are saying occupational murder, because it was a murder, it was a planned murder. The company and the government were in charge of this criminal case, but they have a third partner, which was the union, because they have a collective agreement, they have members, they never controlled occupational health and safety measures, so they just let the murder happen. So they're one of the partners of the crime happened in Soma. And when we've been to Soma after the massacre, someone else went there in advance and informed people about us. So let's say in Soma, I can give thousands of examples, but just give an interesting example. When we were in Soma, miners said welcome, but we learned that you are Shia and we are not going to join your union. And we've been to Kınık, which is another town, 15 minutes far from Soma. And when we made a meeting with the miners from Kınık, they said, sorry bro, we heard that your president is not a Shia, so we're not going to join your union. And with Shia, sects of Islam.
Sunnis and Shia.
Okay. So when it comes to the president of the mining workers union, I know him for a decade. I never talk about religion with him. I don't know if he's a Muslim or he's from which sect, but someone else visit the workers before us and inform them. But the same guy is a Muslim in which one town and a Christian in another town. So it's really tough job to recruit workers, and the subcontractors, they don't have job protection, so they're really afraid of joining unions or attending activities. And in Soma region, while trying to recruit subcontractors, we're not only convincing them, we are trying to help them to break some fears against the state. So we are not competing with a company in Soma, we are competing with the state itself. It's same in the metal sector. Maybe you heard about the metal strikes of last month or 3 weeks ago. There were some massive strikes in the metal sector. I don't know if you heard about that. It's the same issue. Okay. It's the same issue. We were competing with the state. So let's say 3 weeks ago there were some wildcat strikes in Bursa, which can we say it's the heart of Turkish automobile industry. Not only Turkish automobile industry, it's one of the pits for the European automobile industry. The factories are producing for Fiat, Renault, the French automobile company. So the workers, I mean 15 or 20,000 of metal workers who were not happy with their collective bargaining, they went on strike, a wildcat strike, which is not allowed by official trade union codes. They were protesting the union. The first target was union. The second one is the company, but the first one is the union. So it happened in the Bursa region. So we have some recruitment campaigns in Bursa. We make some members. We are shaking hands with the companies in the collective bargaining process. But and suddenly something is happening. Ministry, local authorities are intervening because most of those factories are subcontractors or outsourced companies of the German or European companies. We have meetings with the German company in Germany. We shake hands. Said, your workers, they say, our workers, our employees are free to choose their union. We shake hands and we start the collective agreement process. But the Turkish state doesn't want possibility of strike in the automobile sector. So they're just doing anything to get rid of left-wing unions. But this time, 15,000 of workers, they just start on strike without a union decision. And they were protesting the union. They occupied the factory. They stopped the production for 2 weeks and maybe more. So it's, again, something with the policies of the state. And I'm not talking about the government. So in Turkish case, state and government is something else. So governments can change, but state policies are more permanent. So when it comes to the subcontractors in miners, again, in mines, let's say they join the union, but they never participate in meetings. And sometimes we have to convince their families, their wives, because the wife is quite anxious about her husband, that he's going to lose her job. And we have a small dormitory in our union office. Whenever a miner, let's say, kicked out of house by the wife because of the trade union activities, we have some small beds for such cases. But it's a general issue, not in only in Soma. Subcontractors, they don't have job protection, and they are afraid of joining unions, but this is a kind of facet circle. Unless they join unions and they campaign, they will never have their job protection. So it will take some time.
Just before moving in with other questions and comments, I would like to refer to what Bea said about La Via Campesina and small-scale agriculture. I think this is also relevant because Kivanc also mentioned that agricultural workers in Turkey are not unionized and they are not allowed to form unions by law. But actually, Çiftçisen, the La Via Campesina chapter, there was this court case to shut it down, but actually they won the case in the Supreme Court, so it's on again. 2013, as of 2013, but however its reach is still very limited, I guess. I mean, within the agricultural producers and particularly with the agricultural workers, I would say.
They have to reorganize themselves after all those years of exclusion.
Yeah, so there is a necessity. But going back to what Diego mentioned about what may be the role of trade unions in a green syndicalist future, where actually workers may have a say in what to produce, how, and for whom. I think these metal workers' strikes are also telling in terms of it was the own initiative of the workers themselves to take over the factory in a very similar to Italian autonomous fashion. But also the whole automobile sector is one of the sectors that we reflect a lot upon in terms of what would it mean to have an automobile sector in a degrowth future or in solidarity economics. So we may need to actually consider what would the steel workers, metal workers do in terms of reconfiguring the existing industrial system. And one thing that I also would like to add on that is the green industrialism or green extractivism, because we also see traces of this in Turkey and in other countries. For example, in the case of, again, going back to coal issue, one of the biggest power plants in Zonguldak, ZS3, which is owned by Eren Holding, a big energy utility company, when you go on their website, you realize that actually they've been organizing a lot of public events on the health impacts of smoking. So they are very concerned about health impacts of smoking while they're actually investing in imported Colombian coal to produce energy in the very same region. So these may be issues that actually we may want to keep in mind while talking about the potential green syndicalist features. First here.
Is this necessary or is filming? Is that, yeah, okay, yeah, cool. Thanks, this is really fascinating. I've always been my name's Jay Blair, by the way, for those who don't know me. I'm a visiting research fellow in geography at Manchester, based in New York, actually an anthropologist. This has always been an issue close to home. I've always been really interested in how, green and blue can be two sides of the same coin, or red, however you want to put it. But I want to kind of push us in a couple different directions. So first, I think some people might be familiar, for example, with that article, are you an environmentalist or do you work for a living? And, these can be provocative and polemical ideas. But I think there's a certain kind of nostalgia in focusing on, this kind of industrial critique. Because I think it can be, somewhat masculinist, definitely, and I think doesn't necessarily engage in the kind of flexible labor or accumulation that we have in a neoliberal regime of accumulation in the first place. To give you a little background, I actually used to work for Sierra Club as well, and I actually was really involved in their union. So I was a shop steward and negotiated a contract. I was on their negotiating team. We were actually part of the United Auto Workers, actually. So lots of contradictions, certainly, of this corporate kind of environmental world, and I think, there are nuanced sort of examples of green syndicalism from within it as well that are worth considering. Definitely huge contradictions on that corporate model of these NGOs, and you know, they have a very romantic idea of conservation in the first place, thinking of nature as use value instead of, you know, having more interesting ideas about production of nature as surplus value. They, for example, you know, they pledged to support Occupy Wall Street, but their #1 donor was Mayor Michael Bloomberg. So, you know, it was really a lot of tragic irony involved in the situation. And, you know, what we did was try to highlight the contradictions within that. One of their biggest, so they go for these huge donors. They have this advancement department, and basically the donors have made it so that the kind of member-run organizations like Sierra Club are no longer really member-run. And so instead of you know, people donating memberships on a normal basis you know, that go towards unrestricted funding for workers, for example, it all goes towards restricted funding for particular causes. One of the biggest causes is coal. And I think, you know, there's another problem. So I think my first point is to try to push for a broader understanding of green syndicalism for the kind of economy that we have between turtles and teamsters. And second, then to think beyond coal and actually keep our eyes on the prize here, because oil, as Timothy Mitchell mentions, is not labor intensive. So I think, you know, the relevance of unionism for that movement against fossil fuels is rather limited. You know, look at examples like Norway right now, which, you know, has made a lot of news, or the descendants of the Rockefeller family that have all divested from coal, right? This is somewhat of a publicity, you know, campaign as well, right? They're still, Norway is completely built on oil, and that's not changing anytime soon. So I think, you know, we have to think of both expanded ideas of green syndicalism and also its limits.
No, I really liked your points. I wasn't gonna go in that direction. I was more interested in how do you build alliances with workers when your propositions are threatening their livelihoods and identities. Just a very basic. I think it's. Amita was making a kind of a similar argument. Like, how do you build alliance with miners when you're struggling against mining, no? So, it's a reflection that we need to make, you know, what kind of propositions are we, what kind of discourses, what kind of engagements we really can have and want to have and should have with workers. In general, in any kind of sector, when we are proposing transitions towards other economies. So that was...
Thanks. Soma is an example. We can see how peasantry moved into proletarian situation and they're expropriated from their land and exploitation already there. And the last incident, the massacre of the workers there is sad, of course. Getting back to what you were talking about, the perception of greening capitalism, to me at least, as a master's student, by the way, I'm Ibrahim at Manchester University, is not environment friendly at all. It seems to me it's a commodification process, i.e. commodification of CO2. These carbon certificates are on stock exchange and they are making billions now. So this environment become another business. People are losing their job, but in the meantime, system use that as job creation. And I was thinking, you know, the Al Gore, for example, from US, who produced one of his documentary called Inconvenient Truth. And following that, he became one of the biggest businessmen in that area. So that illustrates how it works. Then second point I'm trying to raise here is why, and to you from the desk, why and how the desk think environment-friendly business, i.e. using recycling or renewable sources are solution, or at least alternative to surplus value production. In other words, expropriation and exploitation of labor and the nature, because we are in the critical situation, which is the thread of the living metabolism on the earth.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. I think it's a very important issue, and I want to point out something that is related to previous intervention, and it's exactly this point of alliances between informal workers, organized workers, and environmentalists. This is very important, and we should look at this triangulation in any kind of case that we want to look at as a researcher, or we want to be engaged as activists. Indeed, for example, for me there is a clear example in the waste that I'm studying together with Federico De Maria. We have cases in Delhi, cases in Bogota, where there is already an alliance between informal waste pickers, organized workers, and environmentalists. So this is very crucial, because in many of the cases that we can speak about, there will be always this kind of possible alliance that can be useful to understand how to change. Also because these three different perspectives came with different claim inside the struggle, and can open up and enlarge the struggle beyond the single issue that is at stake. And this is very important in a long perspective of changing the process. So I think this is very crucial, and we should look at this deeply. For example, in case of farmer in Italy, it's very clear, because and related to our friends that are engaged with the solidary economy, they completely, often, historically, at least in Italy, overlook the immigrants worker. They were speaking about, you know, there are farmers in Italy, we can be engaged with this farmer and they are good, and we can produce locally and so on and so forth, but they completely dismissed the role of Africans came in the south of Italy and be working in the farmer. They were not farmers, they were working class, no? In some, in very specific case. And now there is an emerging alliances that is, there is a clear example, is called Rosarno, and they are trying also to be engaged with the solidary economy and say, look, there is not just a problem of production, but there is also a problem of immigration. This is very important, no? Because this triangulation emerge again. So I think you are very familiar on that because of your PhD dissertation. You very well at them. So just I gave you these two examples to show how the triangulation is very important, how it can open up different issues that we have to embrace when we look at the struggle, I think. Otherwise, we will be fixed in very, let's say, context issue in the struggle. And this is another point I want to point out. More than look at moments, I would like to see more on specific case studies. No, like now again in Italy. Sorry for my to be too much keen on my country, but there is a clear case of struggle for a petrochemical in Taranto that's very important. It's one of the biggest in Europe and so on and so forth. And there, in that specific case, there is a very complicated issue related to what we do with this industry that now is in the hand of the central government. It was a private enterprises, but still there is a struggle around people that live around there, are not environmentalists per se, people that are working inside, political party from the left that are crashing because of their position to take the industry alive and so on and so forth. So, I mean, these open up struggles and the way in which we want to look at the problem. So I would focus more on just, let's say, movement against something like decarbonization, something like that, on specific case that can help us to understand the struggle, how we have to create alliances, how we have to open up also the argumentation to overcome this kind of industrialization. So, I mean, this is very important from a political ecology perspective, I think. Then I have the last point. I mean, you just quote Stefania, but I think that you say just the name, so the people are not familiar with Stefania. Stefania Barca is an environmental historian, so I think she's doing the most important contribution now, because she wrote a paper that's working class environmentalism. From an historical perspective, she's liking to look at how also our master, Joan Martinez Salier, missed this strain of environmentalism when he thought about the three environmentalism that we know. No? He was missing the working class environmentalism. And Stefania is doing a very important contribution looking at the historical pattern of the working class, how they also struggle in their own struggle on a better environment and a more ecological production. So this is important.
I think well, while all the points are very important, I just would like to add something on what Giacomo said, because this is something I've seen in a meeting earlier this year. So with the social movement that I'm engaged in, with Ecology Collective, we've been organizing a couple of meetings in 3 different cities, in Yalova, Alia, and Çanakkale, which are all threatened with a massive boom of, again, coal-fired power plants. And actually in Yalova, while we had the meeting, so there was this one old man who came up to us, and then he said that, you know what, this whole debate about climate justice and, you know, all this reminds me a lot about what we've been doing as labor agitators back in 70s here in Zeytinburnu in Istanbul, in a working class district, where they have actually worked, where they've done propaganda and agitation to shut down, I don't know how to translate hava gazı, but gas, no, but it's not LPG. No. Hava gazı is a form of hydrocarbons that's very low in quality. So basically that was providing a lot of the heating back in 70s. Coal gas. They actually agitated, the labor movement agitated to shut down a coal gas factory in Zeytinburnu because it was extremely polluting. And this is, I think this fits in line with this working class environmentalism history, which is much less written than other types of environmentalisms. And about, if you would like to give some thought on what others said, or shall we move on?
Hello. Thank you for the conversation is going, and I wanted to continue to what Giacomo said and also Diego, because I mean, one of the conversations that I have now with Stefania is also not only how to think differently about alliances, but also think differently about labor itself. So in a sense, I was expecting that we would actually focus a little bit more, even from a degrowth perspective or from alternative economies, to what is it that we want in this world about labor itself. So in a sense, precisely to point out, you know, can we think of a different economy and perhaps different social economic relations of production that do not just consider the rights of workers. And related to that, I always kind of push to this, because for me it's not just a matter of alliances between already made subjects. We kind of had the title today of invisible subjects, no? This is part of our conversation. Who are these invisible subjects and what do they mean? For me, this is exactly what it means. A worker is an invisible subject. So as long as it doesn't exist as a human, why are we asking for rights for something that is produced socially and through power relations as nobody? So for example, there are authors who write about invisible subjects like Rancière, who points out to the fact that the worker himself is not a human, is a produced social category which is meant to be exploitable, and there will always be exploitable subjects out there. How do we rethink labor and power relations so that, for example, in this new world, the woman is not perceived, by the way, as a hysterical subject that has nothing to do with the process of revolution. I felt very strangely when you said that the woman is just a hysterical capitalist kind of thing. And I know maybe that was not your intention, but it is part of the problem, how we think of alliances, if you want also. We should not just think of alliances in terms of red and blue or green. It's a whole reconfiguration of power relations that is not based on domination, and somehow somebody is always left out in this domination. So how do we speak more, I wouldn't even say inclusively about it, but how do we speak of labor relations that are not based on exploitable subjects, which are always the case somehow?
Okay, we'll get 2 more questions and then we do a comment round and then we have to wrap it up. Is there? Yeah, okay.
Hi, thanks for a really good presentation and for sharing what's going on in your labor struggle. I'm Marcella, I'm from Lund University in Sweden. All right, that's better? Okay, good. I actually, this is a very good segue off of the previous intervention. We're trying to sort of rethink labor in a way that sort of embraces some of these new modalities we're looking at through degrowth and through more circular economies, and looking at how we are classifying and sort of creating these subjectivities, trying to bring this down out of the theoretical into on the ground examples. I'm thinking along the lines of some of the cooperative movements like Mondragon in Spain, where you have these more of that democratic process in deciding what you're producing and for whom and when, and something that sort of breaks that relationship between management and labor and sort of redistributes it where there are decisions that are made about production so that labor becomes owner and it sort of rethinks that strategy. One of the key challenges we're having looking at this capitalism, late capitalism, is the problem of capital being able to move and people can't move. So we have this problem where you'll have a problem, a crisis in capital, and they move the problem around. So we can emancipate the labor struggles of, if that's probably not how they saw it in the Netherlands when they lost their jobs, but they were taken out of the labor pool, but the problems of production of coal are still moved somewhere else in the world. So BP can talk about beyond petroleum, but in a particular area. In another area, they're exploiting just as they were before. So looking at labor again to try to say, well, maybe if we're looking for those partnerships, like what you were talking about, labor is actually, in some of your areas, they're farmers. We're going back to more of a pre-industrial or that moment of industrialization in many cases where you had people who were seasonally loggers and they were farmers, and then sometimes they worked in elsewhere, so they had the means of production for themselves to reproduce themselves, but they also would allow their labor to be used in other enterprises. Looking at where you could find some applied ideas from the kind of discussions we're having, as you're talking to the municipality about ways to look at renewable energy and putting it in the labor agreements, which is commendable just to get that discussion going. Is there a broader agenda perhaps that's looking at the localism movements, that are looking at the devolving of powers into the hands of those who are making the products and are being part of it, so that it's much like what we saw yesterday, they are now engaged in the process as owners and participants in the process. So we get out of this Fordian model where we allow ourselves to be in that production line and disempowered from the means of production. Maybe this might be that moment actually where we truly do bridge the movements and actually reinsert a power relation that's much more just and equitable, that allows people who are citizens labeled as workers, but to sort of re-empower them as who they are, to say that they want to have a part in that decision making and have a part in the process of the use of power and how their labor power is used. Maybe this might be that moment we can actually allow labor to move and be more freely seen as people and citizens who are reproducing themselves and their families and want a safe environment in which to do that. Thank you.
Hi there. I'd like to continue maybe on that, or just when I hear or think about these issues, I think one of the main questions that I have was actually asked yesterday at the co-op that we visit, or the cooperative that we visit. Is the question is, okay, you might own the means of production, but what makes you not capitalist? And I think the problem there, it's quite a serious problem, and it relates to also what was just said in the sense of we talk about, you know, energy sources, we talk about trade unions as workers, etc. And I think one of the problems is also what is done with these products, and in the sense of it's not just ownership, but it is, I mean, on the theoretical level, it's called the law of value. You know, who produces more cheaply, and if you know the neighbor or the next country is producing the same product for, you know, a fifth of the price, it's pretty difficult to not exploit oneself. So I think the question there is, in that sense, relating to what was just said, is sort of trying to also, it's not just a reappropriation of the means of production, it's the reappropriation of the market. And in that sense, trying to find ways of bringing not just consumers and or producers and consumers together, but trying to collectively think this, whether it's on a, and here we have the problem then, normally we think this on a local scale, sort of the community supported agriculture or whatever it is, but trying to think this, you know, what does that then imply for, and the question was already asked before, for, you know, cars or for our computers, I mean, or whatever it is. And that's when the big joke comes in, and everyone says, well, you know, oh yeah, well, how's that supposed to happen? But I think those are pretty serious questions in the sense of we understand, we're starting to think about, or have been for a while now, solidarity economies, you know, on smaller scales, but what does that mean scaling up? And, you know, what does that mean for the fiat workers and for the, you know, metal workers and the people who want the cars? And so, you know, or what does that mean for transport? And we need some form of forum to be able to talk about these things. And I think I see one of the main problems in that, because it's this law of value that keeps creeping in and screwing it up, basically. Yeah.
Thank you. Kivanc, maybe you can just, sorry. Well, we have to wrap it up, but sorry. Maybe you can give some of your reflections on the issues that were raised.
So, you know, there are really some good points and good questions, but frankly speaking, I'm not the correct guy to answer the questions. So I told you in the beginning, I came here to hear about your ideas. It was partly a joke, not totally a joke. I'm sorry to make you mad. So let's, you know, start from your point. You know, even, you know, we are asking trade unions asking for employment, job protection, and so. But we are fundamentally we are fighting for some kind of booking terminology. In international unemployment, universal unemployment. We don't want to work. We're asking for a job, we are asking for employment, but we don't want to work. We want to work less and less, and in the end we don't want to work. So I'll give some points and finish. Frankly speaking, you know, the Turkish trade unions and also the international movement is not really engaged with environmental issues. We have lots of things to do. We have lots of homeworks, let's say. And let's say, for some weeks, a Turkish platform, Turkish organization called Justice for Climate, I don't know who they are trying to take an appointment from our leadership. Coalition for Climate, something like that. We never reply them. But if it was a coalition against anti-terror law, we can just accept the meeting. Or something about constitution, something about Rojava, we just invite them in the same week. But Coalition for Climate didn't give a bell in our leadership. So frankly speaking, the situation, the picture is like that. But let's say good news, we're going to start kind of training with TUC from UK with the Polish unions about green syndicalism or green economy. So it's the idea from TUC. I don't know we can realize it in Turkey. TUC has an idea to appoint shop stewards who are in charge of green economy. So let's say we have shop stewards who are in charge of collective bargaining, and now we are having a second position for shop stewards who are in charge of occupational health and safety.
What's shop steward?
Trade union representative in the field, in the plant or in the school. So mostly they are in charge of collective bargaining, like you. Now we're having a second shop steward or trade union rep who are in charge of occupational health and safety, as we have lots of occupational murders. TUC UK has an idea to have a third one who are in charge of green economy, green syndicalism, renewable energy, or pushing companies more environmental friendly. So we start this kind of training with them, but we need some time. And another example, just in the eve of the anniversary of Soma massacre, there was a small fire in one of the plants. So I gave some phone calls to the miners to ask them if they're fine, happy, healthy, and they said, we are so happy about the fire. I was anxious for my friends, but they were really happy. Why? Because of the fire, they didn't work that day. And one of them, a smart activist, he said, it was my idea. I was planning to burn the plant to rescue all my friends. Because if I fire the plant, they don't have to work anymore. So it's a kind of Ludism or sabotage. So he had an idea, the activist had an idea to burn the plant to rescue his friends to work over there. Because it's, in his mind, it's dangerous and it's like a hell working in the plant. So I think it's a favor to destroy the plant. And just in the end of my speech, I want to commemorate someone. 2-3 days ago, I read an article in the newspapers about a guy who was killed while trying to rescue a turtle next to the highway. I don't know if the Turkish friends read the news. There was a newspaper article, a bit popular, about a guy who was trying to rescue a turtle next to a highway, and after a car accident, he passed away. When I read the article, he said, this is my guy, someone, one of us, I said. Next day, I said, one of us. A guy, he lost his life trying to rescue a turtle. Next day, I learned that his son is a political prisoner, and he couldn't leave the prison because the funeral of his father is not in a mosque. He couldn't take permission from the prison to join his father's funeral. And 2 days after the accident, I learned that the guy was father of a friend of mine. So when I read the newspaper, because of what he did, I said, one of us. In 2 days, I learned he was really one of us, and he was a veteran trade union activist, now enjoying his pension in a small village next to sea. But you know, he's never retired from trying to help some other creatures.
Thank you very much. I would like to wrap this session, since we are out of time, with 3 short comments. First one is for Irina, I think. I'm not really sure if invisible subjects would, while acknowledging their use, I'm not really sure if you go to a metal worker in Bursa who's striking and who became visible for the first time in its life, probably, by doing that wildcat strike, and tell them that you are an invisible subject. I'm not very sure about its utility in terms of putting together these issues, while theoretically it may actually provide some dimensions. I think when we talk about bringing together labor movements and ecologist movements, we may need to think beyond, like you said, the existing categories, and then come up with new categories, but probably also focus on the praxis and not get lost in the theory. Another point that I wanted to mention is about the migration issue that was raised, which is an important dimension to environment labor issue, I think, because as we've mentioned, so capital can move, people cannot, but then there is this whole shift from they came to take our jobs away to those people that do the dirty business. And last but not least, maybe to give it a bit of optimism, there is the story of Saab workers. You know, Saab is a big automobile company from Sweden. So actually, after the shutdown of a plant, workers of that plant took the initiative to establish a cooperative, and now they are one of the biggest producers of windmills in Sweden, using their metal processing experience and technology. So while keeping an eye on not romanticizing, I think we should focus on the possibilities and potentialities that exist in terms of putting environmental and labor movements together. So with this, I would like to thank Kivanc for being here, and thank every one of you for participating. Okay, good morning, everyone. This morning we have a rather different session that we try to provide a conversation and try to open a dialogue path between labor struggles, labor movements, and ecological movements. So what we would like to do is to enter in a dialogue, into a conversation rather than a lecture with you guys. And we have a guest today, this morning, who will also help us to further advance on the labor issues and how they may link, how they may relate, and how they may contradict the ecologist agendas, actually. Kivanc is with us from the Confederation of Progressive, or in its Turkish version, Revolutionary Trade Unions of Turkey. And before starting, we actually planned this session, as I said, to be a dialogue. So we would really like you to come forward after this very short presentation, so that we sit in a circle and try to engage in a couple of rather tough questions that labor movements and ecologist movements so far has failed to answer fully. So to start with, I would like to give a bit of a background on what we mean by the convergence of movements in praxis. And I would like to start with two images that you may or may not be familiar of. Has anyone seen this before, or do you guess where it's from?
Onshore workers union, Pacific Coast, maybe California, locally?
Not exactly, but but on the western coast. That's correct. So if this didn't help, maybe this one might help actually. Yes, that is Seattle. So back in '99, we have actually witnessed a key moment in the global justice movement's emergence in a different mode, as some dub it alter globalization or anti-globalization. And one of the key moments in this convergence was the argument with Teamsters and Turtles. So the first one was the Teamsters, the syndicates, the trade union activists, and the other ones were basically environmental activists who were defending sea turtles. And actually, Seattle was an emblematic reunion of those two groups, which was later taken into many different articles as this, like Turtles and Teamsters united at last. And actually, in the years that followed, in the past 16 years after Seattle, we've seen the slogan coming up again on many different occasions, including the famous COP15, Copenhagen Climate Summit, and actually now on the road to COP21, Climate Summit in Paris, we see different versions of this argument, one of them being actually a blockadia argument of Naomi Klein, also linking trade issues, industrial workers, and environmental and climate activism. And I think it's telling that typically, like those groups that are typically uninterested in the environmental question per se, as it's in its purest form, are actually converging from both sides on the use of this argument, particularly in bringing workers' autonomy and democracy in the workplace, but more than it, basically ensuring a better life for all, not for those peasants out there in the field only, but also for the industrial workers themselves who are concerned with environmental matters. And here is a quotation from the former director of the Canadian Automobile Workers Union. Sam Ginden is an activist turned academic who was teaching at York University in Canada. And he says that actually, if we are really serious about incorporating the environmental needs into economy, we need to change the way we produce and consume and how we travel and how we live. And he actually argues that the equipment that we have in hand, the current installed industrial capacity, doesn't need to be used in its current form only. I mean, it may as well be transformed. So that actually, instead of producing cars, we may actually reconfigure the existing industrial system by reshaping it in a way that it contributes to this, be it called circular economy, degrowth, or solidarity economics. So it may be used in different versions and different forms. And actually, he suggests that we cannot, from one day to another, one of the issues that I would like to raise in that sense is the possibility or impossibility of green syndicalism. So whether this may provide an alternative, whether this may actually help to bridge different concerns, particularly in terms of degrowth debates and solidarity economics and so on and so forth. So how can we actually try to move towards an alternative red-green/black vision? And I've been looking into the work of Jeff Shantz, who is also an an activist turned academic, also from Canada. And he suggests that actually the radical syndicalist tradition has a lot to offer to radical ecology movement, and there is a big opportunity for coming together and sharing certain concerns. And some of the key strategies that Jeff Shantz underlines are actually the key methods of key approaches of the radical syndicalist tradition, which is exemplified by the Industrial Workers of the World Union, or in other words, Wobblies. And he argues that these strategies, these methods, are consensus formation, participation of equals, dialogue, decentralization, and autonomy, which, I guess, if you take out of this context and put it in the context of degrowth, or put it in the context of solidarity economics, would go perfectly well. So I think we talk about similar methods, similar issues, but we talk in different domains and different circles. So this session, I hope, will also help to consolidate some of the debates that are ongoing in these different circles, and jump over the accumulated knowledge and experience that has gathered through this industrialization process. But we may consider ways of how to use it better for the society and the environment together as a one and inseparable unity. And actually this means a call towards what we've been hearing a lot over the week, and what we hear a lot from radical scholars as well, a transition into a new economy, or exit from the existing economy as such. And this has particular aspects to it as its alternatives. And most often we talk about an energy transition. We talk about a worker-owned production system, which we have seen actually a prime example yesterday with all of its shortcomings as well in Kazova as workers' cooperative. Then, of course, direct access to agricultural production without intermediaries, credit unions, alternative monetary systems, public transportation, owning the means of production themselves, as well as community food and dwelling resources. But to reach this new economy, I guess we still need to spend a lot more time thinking on how we may actually go beyond the minor experiments, or how we can actually bring together the minor experiments in putting together a broader consortium who would push for such changes. And today,